Now, is it possible to do a sandblasted finish without a sandblaster? Well, in this episode, I attempt to do just that. Greetings friends, and a very warm welcome to you all. Mirrored and brushed are the most common types of finishes you'd see on a stainless steel watch. The brush finish is usually in a straight grain, circular grain, or sometimes sunburst, and you've seen me do all these types of finishes using my polishing and lapping machines. But here you can see this very even factory sandblasted finish without any lines or grains. And within the storm in my brain whilst brainstorming for new video topic ideas, I asked myself, can this most factory looking of finishes be achieved at home using some basic bits and bobs? Well, I've decided to experiment and ruin a collectible watch so you don't have to, and the results were quite interesting. Now, this is part of a longer restoration video of a TAG Heuer 2000 series special Moondust edition from the 1980s, but I thought this experiment required its own longer video showing all the different processes and mistakes I made along the way. I'm still working on the full video, which should be out in a few weeks, and boy, did someone really go to town on this poor watch with the 3-in-1. So make sure you tune in for that one by subscribing if you're not already subscribed. So this is the case and bracelet of that watch, and it has its original factory sandblasted finish, but the case has lots of scratches and dings. Usually I'd polish these out, bish bosh, no dramas, and then apply a brush finish. But this time I want to try and achieve that original factory look. But I don't have a sandblaster. I'm also running out of room in my workshop for any further large pieces of equipment, and I don't really have the desire to invest in a large sandblasting setup. So I thought I'd use a rock tumbler, which I have from a rock polishing phase that I went through many years ago. So you saw some of those horrific battle scars on this case. And one more piece of equipment that I am saving some room for is a laser welder. So it would have been nice to fill some of the wounds as I did in the Jaeger-LeCoultre reverso video, which you can watch up here. But I think a lot of those marks are just displaced metal and not metal that has been lost. So I'll try pull some of those out. Good lord, look at that really long tool mark on this case back that runs right through that letter M. So we have to be very careful when trying to remove that without harming any of that text or accidentally polishing out that rough texture around the logo. Now these parts have years of dirt and grit embedded in all the nooks and crannies, so it's really important to give them a thorough clean before any polishing work, otherwise those bits of dirt and grit will just contaminate your mops and cause unwanted scratches to your parts. The grit will get stuck into your mop and polishing compound and just drag across your parts, creating fine scratches. So now that the parts are free of all arm cheese, let me see if I can pull some of those dings out. Filling the scars with metal and a laser welder would be an easier option, but using the right mops, compounds, speed and heat, we should be able to achieve a good result. I use a stiff mop and this grey cutting compound for steel, which gets nice and greasy, generating a good amount of heat. The case has a flat side profile with sharp lines, but the top part is curved, so I use all the surfaces of my wheel to try and remove all those marks whilst trying to maintain those original lines and contours. Now usually I would remove the tube when doing this sort of work, but I need the tube attached, as I'll explain later, and the tube isn't causing any sort of obstruction. Now I know you're all getting impatient and you want to see the sandblasted experiment, but if we are to get a half decent result with the final sandblasted finish, I need to make sure that this prep work is bang on point. It doesn't really matter if there are fine swirls or scratches left over from the mop, but the deep stuff needs to come out. And about 20 minutes on this case, I think I'm getting somewhere. And that lug where we had that mess seems to be reorganizing itself under all that heat and pressure, but there is still a pesky little dimple still there, but I do manage to get it out eventually. Now here is another good example of metal being displaced rather than being lost, which may have required some laser welding. You can see how the displaced metal due to an impact has caused the line to drop as the metal pushed away from its original location. So we can try and push that back in with friction and heat using our greasy mop. And now you can just tell this is an 80s bracelet with this recognizable flimsy design consisting of many small individual links, but they are very comfortable bracelets. Each part of the link is rounded, so I need to fold it and do each link at a time. I will use a combination of the stiff mop and a stitch mop to get into all those rounded areas to remove all those scratches. Now each link has 3 separate elements, so that's a lot of individual parts to orientate and polish, so it can get tedious. But it's important not to lose patience here, otherwise you'll end up with flat spots. So keep calm, trust the process, and take a step back if you need to. Wow, look at the difference. I've done one half of the bracelet, but just take a look at the scratches on the part I haven't done. Removing scratches using the method I've used will naturally leave you with a shiny finish, and sometimes this can fool you into believing that you've done a great job. But look closely at the part that I've worked on and you can still see some of those scratches. So I'll need to go over those areas again. Oh my word, this clasp looks like it's been used as a butcher's block, and the logo, rather than being carved into the clasp, is 3D on top of the clasp, so we have to try and preserve that. I'll try not to touch the logo at all. The text and logo on the caseback have been carved in, so we can take a different approach with that, using a combination of the felt wheel and flat lap. Managed to remove most of the big marks, and as a result it's all been sort of mirror polished. It's not the intention, it's just the byproduct. These are the bracelets, and the clasp. You can see I've managed to preserve the logo by taping around and doing all sorts. There's the case back as well. I managed to get that little scratch out without sort of damaging the text, but still got a little bit there. Okay, so now after a good clean, it's time for our little experiment using this tiny little rock tumbler. I bought this about 7 to 8 years ago when I was going through a bit of a phase with polishing opal. It was cheap and compact, and it came with some media, so I just want to get an idea of what I can achieve with what I have before I start throwing more money at this. So here I have some silicon carbide, and this stuff can get pretty nasty. It becomes really fine as you use it and gets airborne, so use a mask if you still have one from back in the day. I also have some sand, and I think it's just builder's sand, and some walnut shells. But first I decided to go with steel on steel with these steel shots. I'm not sure if I need a larger quantity of this stuff or not, but I threw it into the barrel with some soap and water. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I left the tube on the case as I want to stick the crown back on. I'm also sticking the glass back in and putting the case back on with this gasket. And I did this as I was a bit concerned that this process may interfere or damage the fine tolerances to the glass gasket seating and the thread on the crown tube and the case back. This way I can protect those parts of the case by sacrificing the battered old crystal and a damaged crown from a previous project. And plop, I stick all the parts in except for the diver's extension and the folding clasp, which will have a mirrored finish. I've never tried this process out before, so at this point I still don't know what to expect. So I had these parts in with the steel shots for around 5 hours. Now I've seen people just stick their rocks in these tumblers and leave them running for days and weeks. So I may have been a little too hasty in abandoning this particular media after only 5 hours. And I did this because the steel balls were creating quite deep pits and cuts on the parts. This may be due to the way the parts were dropping quite forcefully onto the shots due to the ridges inside the barrel, or maybe I needed to pack the whole barrel with lots of steel shots so that the drop isn't as violent, or maybe my newly polished parts were exaggerating the pits in isolation and may have evened themselves out over a longer period. I did speak to a few companies who specialize in these machines and media, and they recommended ceramic media but in a vibrating tumbler like this one, which doesn't drop the part as it does in a tumbler, but rather smothers the part as it vibrates around. So then I thought, since the title of the process has the word sand in it, let me try some sand. And I have lots of sand, which will provide that smothering effect without violently throwing the part around. And we all know what happens to rocks and pebbles on a beach over millions of years. Well, we don't have millions of years, so I tried the sand out dry for about another 5 hours and wasn't really confident that anything would happen. And this is probably a better view of what the steel shots did to the case and my justification for abandoning that process. I decided not to try the walnut shells as I think that would have been too soft to give us any sort of meaningful result. So now I've removed all those pits again and I've decided to straight grain it and see if that sand will just flatten out those sort of straight lines and sort of make the job a little bit easier for the sand instead of going from mirror polished. So I don't know whether to use the silicon carbide just yet. So stick that back in there and see. This is the sort of sandblasted finish that I'm trying to achieve. As you can see, the difference between straight grain and a sandblast finish. You can see how smooth that finish is. There's no lines or anything. Unlike this one, you can see the straight lines. So let's stick that back in there. I think I need to leave it in for quite a bit. The rest of it I'll just put it back in as it is and maybe just give it a little longer. Obviously the sand isn't a great idea for all the pins and stuff in your links. Don't want them to be ground down, but let's just experiment and see. So I've had this thing in there for about 5 hours now and I don't think it's gonna work, to be honest. See, the brushed look is still there, but you can see the clasp. So I don't know whether I should get a vibrating tumbler and try some different types of media. So I think I'm gonna have to take a little pause and reflect and see what to do next, because this isn't working. It's in a bracelet. Deary me. Or shall I try the silicon carbide? That silicon carbide here. This walnut shell is obviously really soft. I don't think that's going to do anything to steel. Suppose I could try that. Give it one more try overnight. So now onto the nasty stuff. And you can see the fine dust getting airborne and into my nose. I think you can buy this stuff in various grits, but they will eventually grind down to produce fine particles and dust. So as you've just seen, I did remove those pits caused by the steel balls and decided to straight grain the case. I thought maybe by removing the mirror polish I could give the sand a helping hand, but it wasn't happening, and you can imagine these experiments were taking days. So you can hear the disappointment in my voice as I was contemplating abandoning this whole project and the video. But I don't give up that easy, and I just decided to stick the parts in the silicon carbide and just leave the bloody thing and forget about it. So I left it overnight and checked again after about 14 hours, and finally I could see some results which gave me confidence to leave it in for another 24 hours. And here you can see the initial results. We can still see some of the straight grain on the case, but the end links and the bracelet and clasp were starting to look like a sandblasted finish. I did notice some parts of the bracelet folding in on itself and hiding away from the media, so some links remained shiny. So I tried pinning both ends together with some steel wire, but that didn't make much of a difference. I need to find a way to wrap the bracelet onto something solid so it doesn't fold. I also concluded that this sort of fine media is bad for the pins that hold the links together, so the larger recommended ceramic media should solve that problem going forward. You'll see many Rolex Jubilee bracelets sagging over time due to the pins wearing away over the years from wear and tear, aided by grit and grime. But I think in this experiment, once the fine silicon carbide got into any openings to the pins, it was stuck in there and not moving around too much to cause any significant wear. And to stop myself sneezing till I peed my pants, I've decided to seek some assistance from good old water. And here are the final results after about 3 days. What do you guys think? I wasn't too impressed with the overall finish, but this experiment has given me lots of ideas, and I think with the right tumbler and the correct media, we can achieve a good sandblasted finish at home. But as for the current results, I decided to give everything a light buff just to even everything out. The finish does look a bit gritty, and I'm not sure if a longer period of time would have smoothened it all out. The text and logos on the case back and the clasp haven't been damaged or faded, so that's something positive. But if you compare the finish with the original factory finish, we're miles away. Another positive is that this process hasn't really rounded any of our straight lines on the side of the case. Check out the glass though. And that's interesting, it's removed all the scratches on the glass, so I could just polish that up with some cerium oxide, but sadly it did pick up some chips to the edges. And the vibrator would have been better. Well done. The end links came out pretty nice though, which again gives me an indication and some hope that this process can work. So here I am, just giving it a few rubs on my finishing mop just to soften everything out a little bit. I didn't want to overdo it in case I end up shining it up again. I'll show you a side-by-side comparison in a second. So I hope you guys found this experiment interesting and helpful, and I do some other weird experiments with the rest of this project, which I've teased some of you with on Instagram and in the community post section, so make sure you put your notifications on to see the full video. This watch was one of my favorites back in the day, and I used to sell quite a few of these when they were still available, but now they have become very scarce indeed. Also, if any of you have tried this method or a similar method, let us know your experiences in the comments. So here are the side-by-side before and after shots, and I think as a first time experiment diving into the unknown with very little information and probably the wrong tools, we achieved a respectable result. I will definitely revisit this experiment, so stay tuned. Anyway friends, thank you for your company today, and I ask you kindly to like, share, subscribe and all that good stuff, because they've cancelled Gary Lineker and Miss Rachel for speaking up for poor, hungry, scared children, so I've got no chance. And if you intentionally starve children and still expect the world to think you're the good guy, then you're an evil lunatic. Trot.